again, thank you for being here for our employment law update with Anne-Marie Story at Redmond Winchell, joined by Karen Sichters in the background. And I'm Deb Newman, President and CEO of the Bangor Region Chamber of Commerce here in our offices. And Shelley Sund is our Director of Marketing and Events, producing this event for us today and always doing a fabulous job. And she's at home. Just mark your calendar. We are going to be bringing this to you twice this month, February 8th today, and then 3 p.m. on February 22nd. So before we started, Anne-Marie Story and I were kind of catching up on a few things that we want to touch on with you today. And just a reminder, this is your event. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom. Ask your questions. If you're watching us on Facebook, you can comment or private message us. I am downtown, so if you hear background noises of fire trucks, that's why. I'll mute myself momentarily. It's tax time, woo! And Anne-Marie, you mentioned to me something about W-2 reporting and Ffcr8. Why don't we start there?
Okay, and as I said, I know nothing about taxes, literally. So I'm only raising this because it was in the news and I want to make sure our employers know about it. But apparently W-2s, which have to be issued by the end of this month, no, by the end of January had to have been issued, are supposed to include any payments made to an employee under the Ffcr8 for last year. So according to this article, if you did not include them, you can file an amended version, but you ought to talk to a payroll or tax specialist about that, not me. I just want to make sure you're aware that that's an issue. And that's literally all I know about it.
Good. That's we appreciate that from you. Thank you. And then there's been quite a few updates with Eeoc, OSHA, so workers' comp update you want to talk about, and Fmla as well. So I'll let you start wherever you'd like to start.
All right, obviously the big one is OSHA because that was a fairly long guidance, but so let's hold that for a minute and just mention some of these other things. I did want to mention workers' comp quickly. It's not any major change. I don't want anybody to get worried or upset about it. It was literally a reminder from the board that showed up on the website. And I want to make sure employers remember that just because they might disagree with somebody's representation that they have contracted COVID and that it's work-related does not mean they don't have an obligation to file a first report of injury and a NOC if they disagree with it. So, so the board has pretty much reiterated that if somebody reports that they have contracted COVID and they believe it to be work-related, an employer cannot just say, I don't agree, I'm not doing anything. That would be the wrong thing to do. What you must do is file the first report anyway, and if you disagree, you can file a notice of controversy, which you should do and you must do within 14 days. So employers who have somebody report that to them, the bottom line is tell your insurance company immediately because they will know what to do. And your obligation is to make sure that they are informed so they can take the right steps. The same is true if somebody gets a vaccine and you have encouraged or required them to have that vaccine and they come back and say, I had a bad reaction, I've had to go to the doctor, this is work related. You may disagree, but you still have to file a first report of injury and a notice of controversy in a timely manner. So just a reminder that regardless of whether you agree or disagree with somebody's claims that something is work-related, you still have to take action. So be sure to notify your carrier right away. So there's that. And then I did want to just note that we had talked before last time, and this was fairly new at that point, about whether or not an employer could offer an incentive to their employees to be vaccinated. So that's kind of up in the air right now because the EEOC had issued that updated guidance about whether or not you can do that under a wellness plan. And their interpretation is that you can only give a very small minimal incentive, like, for instance, they say a very small gift card. to somebody to encourage them to get the vaccine or to reward them for doing that. But if it's not part of a wellness plan and you're not giving the shot, the issue is, and you've seen some of the big, like Dollar Store, I think, is doing this, and some of the other very large national employers are offering people pay or time off if they go and have a vaccine. So there's a large group, I think it's 42 business groups, sent a letter to the EEOC last week asking them for clarification about what are we allowed to do? Can we give an incentive? Can we not give an incentive? And if we can, what are we talking about? Something seriously minimal or something a little more substantial than that? So the EEOC is not under any obligation to respond, so who knows whether they will or they won't, but hopefully they will. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce was one of the signatories to that letter, so I anticipate we'll get updates in the event EEOC does decide to give us some more information. And then the other thing before the OSHA stuff is I did want to raise the issue of FMLA now that we're in a new calendar year. So this would be especially applicable right away to employers who follow a calendar year reporting under the FMLA. If somebody took time off last year, even if it was for the FFCRA or for, even if not the FFCRA, for other COVID related reasons or any reason at all, you should still evaluate this year whether they meet the 1,250 hour requirement if and when they ask for new leave time. So in other words, I think everybody probably knows under the federal law, you have to have worked 1,250 hours at the time of your request in order to qualify for FMLA time. What I think employers forget sometimes is when somebody's been employed, you want to look back for that year prior and be sure they actually have worked that 1,250 hours to qualify them for the new time. And the fact that somebody was off for COVID related reasons means they may not meet that threshold, because if somebody was furloughed, for instance, that's not work time under the FMLA. So that does not count toward working time. So they may not have met that threshold. And the same is true if they took paid or unpaid leave under the FFCRA. So just because it's protected time off doesn't mean that it also counts toward that threshold. So just a warning to employers, or something to keep in mind, that when an employee now that we're in a new year, or if you're on a rolling basis, you have to calculate it differently, of course. Just be sure that they still meet that threshold, just like always. It's no different than it's ever been. It's just that people are taking so much more time off that I want to be sure employers don't forget to go through that assessment. Now, of course, if you're only covered by state FMLA, this doesn't apply because there is no hourly requirement.
Quick question came in. Is it worked hours only?
Yes, work hours. So if somebody's furloughed or they're on unpaid leave time, that does not count toward their 1,250. Okay, so those are my little quick updates. So the big news, of course, is the OSHA information that came out last week. And so what this is, and I very strongly encourage all employers to go read this. Because we're going to go through a synopsis of it, but it's a long document, and I encourage everybody to look at it. It was issued on January 29. It's on their website, and what it does is it's called Protecting Workers: Guidance on Mitigating and Preventing the Spread of COVID in the Workplace. And it's the document that the OSHA was directed to come out with under President Biden's first executive order. So remember, we talked last time about how OSHA was given, I think it was 2 weeks at that point, to come out with some new guidance, and that's what this is. It is not legally binding in the sense of being a law. Technically, it's a guidance. But you would be very ill-advised to not take this into strong consideration in forming your own policy or amending whatever policy you currently have, because when OSHA looks back to see if you're meeting your general duty, this is what they're going to look at. So this is what you need to review and make sure. Now, there's a lot of it in here that's no different than what they had said before about procedures in the workplace, for instance, cleaning after you've had a positive case and, you know, generally keeping people socially distanced and that sort of thing. But there are some differences here. And I want to be sure everybody's aware of some of those. I know we had sent out an email blast that highlighted a few of them, but I thought that we should go through it. But again, every employer ought to go and read this document. So just as some examples, they put some emphasis on employees' roles and rights in the workplace about COVID. So they say, first of all, the employees should be involved in the development of the COVID prevention program. Now, whether that means you form a committee who has input into workplace practices that you can get feedback from, you know, is social distancing working? Are people wearing masks? Are there cleaning procedures we're not doing that you think we should be doing? What kind of suggestions do you have? You know, that's the kind of thing you might consider doing. This doesn't mean that if you already have a policy, I think that you don't have to do anything. I think if you already have a policy, which hopefully everybody does, maybe now you sort of reiterate or form this committee or pick a few representatives or however you want to do this and say, you know, is there any feedback to how this is working? Does anybody have any suggestions for things we might do differently or better? I think it's going to be important to do that. The employees should be informed of the terms of the program and resources available to them. I assume that most everybody's plan or policy already does that. In terms of resources, I don't know what that means specifically, but certainly CDC and OSHA might be those kinds of resources. If somebody was looking for information about, you know, what the basis of the plan is, then it would be coming from the CDC and OSHA. And so maybe that's what that is. Employees should be specifically told the employer is obligated not to retaliate against them for bringing COVID-related concerns to the attention of the employer, media, or the public. So that's important. I mean, that's essentially a whistleblower statement, right? But it's going to be important to reiterate that, not just to the employer, because I think probably most everybody has a plan that says, or hopefully you do, if you have concerns, please see HR or whatever it says. But I'm pretty sure most of them don't say, you know, bringing things to the attention of the media or the public, which I'm not saying it means you now have to have a plan that says, hey, by the way, you can go public with things if they upset you. But it sounds like a standard whistleblower protection sort of statement to me. And so I think people want to think about that. It also says, and this is something that probably most of them do not have, that your prevention program should include an anonymous process for workers to voice concerns about COVID-related hazards. And I'm guessing most of them do not have that. In fact, we're working now internally to come up with some kind of email system where people can report things anonymously. You might do it through a phone system, or even a, you know, maybe even a comment box that's left somewhere. But please, if you're going to do that, I actually had a case about this a long time ago, not about COVID, obviously, but please check the comment box. So don't let a year go by without actually looking in it to see what the comments are. But that would be one way to have it anonymous. Now, that isn't going to work if you have everybody remote. So you'll have to come up with a plan that fits whatever your current work environment is. But it's going to be important that people have the ability to report anonymously. And then they also have a section about the elements of a prevention plan, many of which you probably already have. Number one, you conduct a hazard assessment. And again, if you've already done all these things, I'm not saying you have to go back necessarily and do them again, but it would probably be worth confirming, number one, that you have done them. and maybe updating them every so often. So if you put your initial plan out 3 months ago, maybe you go back and reevaluate it now, because things do change, and obviously the CDC keeps changing, and so anyway, conduct a hazard assessment, identify control measures to limit the spread of the virus, adopt policies for employee absences that don't punish workers. So that's interesting, because that's, to me, I don't know that OSHA's really weighed in before about absenteeism plans, but it makes sense. I mean, they're saying basically encourage potentially infected workers to remain at home. So there you get your guidance from the CDC about when people shouldn't be there. But I think every plan ought to have a very clear statement, and I think most of them do. If you're not feeling well, if you have symptoms that could be indicative of COVID, for goodness sakes, stay home. And whether that means you get tested or you don't get tested, I guess that's up to each individual plan. But at the very least, I think they're saying, do not encourage people to come in if they're not feeling well just because they don't have a positive test, right? Or if they're here and they're not feeling well, then for goodness sakes, go home. So there's that. And now, by the way, it doesn't say anything about giving people specific time off that's paid or anything else. So your guidance, on what to do with somebody in those circumstances comes from all the other leave laws that we've talked about, and how to get through those in terms of whether someone's entitled to paid time or is it going to be unpaid time. But I do think this is quite a statement that nobody is going to look favorably on terminating somebody who asks for time off because they don't want to expose somebody at home, or they're not sure if they're feeling well. I think there's going to have to be a lot of latitude that's continued to be given with either remote work or unpaid time off. Ensure that policies are communicated to both English and non-English speaking workers. Hopefully that goes without saying, but if you do have a non-English speaking population, just be sure that's happening. And again, they say implement protections from retaliation for workers who raise COVID-related concerns. That's a big one. In addition to that, they have some new input on masks and face coverings. And one of these I find very confusing. I don't know what this means yet, and we've had a lot of discussion about this, because what it says is we recommend face coverings, quote, be made of at least 2 layers of a tightly woven breathable fabric, such as cotton, and should not have exhalation valves or vents. So I think, I'm no expert, but I'm looking at my normal mask, which is just the cotton kind that a lot of people wear. And I would say this is 2 layers because it's sort of got a front and it's got a back. So I don't think the timing on this was interesting, because at the same time this came out, there were all those headlines all of a sudden about wearing 2 masks. But I don't think that's what this is saying. I think the regular masks that everybody's been wearing so far, even those normal throwaway ones, are actually 2 layers. So I don't think they're saying now we're on board with this wearing 2 masks business, but that's just the way I'm interpreting it. I think it just was coincidence that those 2 things happened to come out at exactly the same time.
So here's a question: who trumps whom, the CDC guidelines or OSHA, when it comes to some of these things that are?
Well, hopefully they work jointly. And actually the CDC has not said to wear 2 masks. I noticed that they backed off on that last week when they were sort of pressed about it. And he said, oh, well, it's still in the process of testing. So I think the general statement was, if 1 mask is good, then 2 is better. But I don't think that rose to the level of now we're saying everybody's got to wear 2 masks.
Right.
So I think what OSHA is saying, and I don't think the CDC disagrees at this point, is that the normal mask is a front and back, and that's the 2 layers they're talking about. But it does talk about those exhalation valves or vents, and a lot of the exercise ones, for instance, have those. So it's now specifically saying those are not good enough. So while you might be able to wear that at home or outside running or in the gym, not in the workplace, according to this. And then it also says employers should provide face coverings to workers at no cost. I think pretty much everybody is doing that. You see, I mean, even when you go in a store, there are baskets for people who come in, customers who don't have them, but be sure you're giving those to your employees as well. And it raises the issue of discussing the possibility of reasonable accommodation when somebody can't wear a face mask due to a disability. We've talked about that. It does specifically say, and this is something we've mentioned before, if you have a workplace that has a person who is hard of hearing, you are responsible to provide face or to allow people, or even provide, well, it says employers should acquire masks. So this insinuates that the employer is the one who should be giving these out. Clear coverings over the mouth for all workers to facilitate lip reading. So if you have a hearing challenged person, you're going to have a little bit of a different requirement there. But again, you still have to make sure that it's safe and meets the OSHA guidelines, because see, this says clear coverings, but I don't think they're talking about that mask with just with the plastic thing in the front, because they've already said that's not good enough. What I saw, and in fact, I saw an article about Nike now has its employees wearing a mask that has a clear place where the mouth is. So it's still a covering, but it's clear, whereas the rest of it is cloth. And I think that's what OSHA is referring to, that kind of mask. So it still meets the basic mask requirements, but it also has a clear place so somebody can see your mouth. So that's new from them.
Anne-Marie, somebody just asked about neck ups. Does OSHA mention anything about whether neck ups are accepted? You know,
Yeah, I'm not going to say no, because I'm not certain that it doesn't mention it in this guidance, and they should check it to be sure. Last I saw from OSHA, they were saying those aren't good enough. Like those neck gaiter things, that they're not sufficient. But I don't know if they've changed. I don't think they've changed the status on that. It does now specifically say that if you have a workplace where face coverings can become wet and soiled, that you provide workers with replacements daily or more frequently as necessary. So, I mean, just as simple as something like a car wash. If you've got people working outside and it can become wet and even freeze now in this weather, you need to make sure people have ones that continue to be safe. Let's see what else. Okay, so here's the big one. The guidance actually says employers should make a COVID vaccine or vaccination series, quote, available at no cost to all eligible employees. That's big.
Want to say that one again? Repeat.
Yeah, it says employers should make a COVID vaccine or vaccination series, quote, available at no cost to all eligible employees. So that can mean a lot of different things. And I don't know. I mean, for most of us, that's not even applicable yet. And I think a lot of the healthcare employers who are having these done are as far as I understand, these are being made available mostly at no cost, either because of insurance or even the government's paying for them. I'm not sure how that works. But this is interesting. So it's not clear to me whether this is saying, number one, you must make the vaccine available, and you must make it available at no cost, and you must make people have it, because that's a very broad reading of this. The other way to read it is to say, if somebody wants it, then you make it available to them at no cost. So that it's not, in other words, it's not telling you you have to force people to have it. It's just saying that if you want people to have it and they agree to have it, that somehow you make it available at no cost to them, whether that's through insurance or underwriting it yourself or some other program. I don't think this is saying every employer has an obligation to vaccinate every employee. That would be way too broad a reading of this, I think. I think what it's saying is if you make it available or if you ask people to have it or if you want them to have it, that you find a way to assist them in getting it so it's not costing them. Again, where the anticipation is that there's going to be more of this because there was that next March deadline. I think it's March 12, I'm not sure, by which they're supposed to issue even more firm guidance. So whether all of this is going to become more of a requirement than a guidance that's sort of the speculation right now, but we're going to get more from them than what we have right now. It does say that the general duty clause will apply to making sure your workplace is safe. I don't think there's any question. I think we've said it a million times, and the answer is if you are confronted by OSHA about whether you've met your general duty, they're going to go back through this guidance and they're going to want to know what you've done and what you haven't done. And again, it may not be that all of these things fit with every single workplace, but to the extent that it does, I think the more you can show that you complied with it and made an effort to comply with it, the better off you're going to be. And the question, of course, is they're going to get more involved. I mean, that's the presumption, is that OSHA, especially under the new administration, is going to be far more involved in workplaces now than they ever were before, especially given this situation. Okay, so yeah, what I said March 12, it's March 15, and they are charged with issuing what's called an emergency temporary standard by then, if it's necessary, and that is legally binding. So whereas this is guidance, if they were to issue an emergency temporary standard, that's not a choice. So we'll see if this guidance becomes that, or they don't issue it. We just don't know. But for right now, this is what we have to follow. And then they go through a lot of details about things we've talked about at length. None of this is new, about distancing and putting up barriers and face coverings and ventilation and hygiene and cleaning and disinfecting, screening infectious or potentially infectious employees. So all of those things, again, every employer ought to review this guidance and make sure they're doing all of the things that they probably ought to already be doing.
Let you catch your breath here. That's a lot for everybody to digest. If you Shelley found the link, it's in the chat. The OSHA issued guidance as of January 29th, 2021. So there's a direct link to that. If you have any questions about anything that Anne-Marie's shared with us so far, please post it in the Q&A or on Facebook. We do have a question, Anne-Marie. What if we're, as an employer, not requiring the vaccine?
Yeah, I don't think this is saying that you have to require the vaccine. I don't think the government has definitely not gone that far yet. I think what they're saying is, but if you do, then you ought to find a way to pay for it. So you shouldn't put that burden on your employees to pay for something that you're asking them to have, especially something as important as the vaccine.
And what is, and I don't know if this is the right term, but what is sort of the safe harbor for businesses with so much changing constantly now with the new administration coming in and OSHA issuing new guidelines? Employer, there's a lot to know, and if an employer is just not keeping up with it or misses something, what's the potential liability? What could possibly happen to them?
Well, I mean, you could get a fine if the OSHA does evaluate your workplace and determine that you violated the general duty clause. You certainly could be fined, and nobody ever wants that to happen, because once you're fined once, not only are you on the radar, but they go up incrementally, and never mind being on the front page of the news. So you want to avoid that at all costs, of course. And I mean, I think, I don't know how much latitude they're going to be willing to give people, but I suspect that especially small businesses, to the extent that you can show you did your best, basically. I mean, I think if OSHA comes in, an employer says, well, I don't have a written plan. I just assumed everybody was going to do the right thing and wear a mask. That's not going to be acceptable at this point. I mean, I don't think there's any employer out there who could say, we didn't know that we were supposed to have a plan for the workplace. So I think that's the very basic minimum at this point. And I can't imagine that anybody doesn't know there is an OSHA site. It tells you what you need to do. There is a CDC site. So if you start from that very basic premise, then I think there's a lot of degree about, well, how many rules do we have, and how do we enforce them, and how extensive is the policy? And again, I think it depends on your workplace. I mean, I don't think an employer with 3 employees is going to be held to the same standard as a 1,000-employee organization with an entire department who's, working with this. But I do think there are some very basic requirements that you're going to have. And the bottom line is the more you have that you can show them when they come in, the better off you're going to be. So as opposed to saying, oh, well, we told everybody to make sure they wear their mask, write it down. Even if your policy is a paragraph long, it's better than not having one at all, because it shows. I mean, you don't want an employee to come back and say, I don't know, I don't ever remember them telling me to wear a mask, even though you swear that you did. So, I think there's some very basic things that every employer can and should be doing. And I'm not sure anybody could reasonably say at this point they didn't know that they needed to at least meet some very basic things.
I thought the whistleblower piece was really interesting. Can you revisit that again?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised by it at all, because, whistleblower protections are important. They already exist under a lot of state and federal laws, and it's not at all a surprise. In fact, even before the statement being made here, it seems pretty clear that a whistleblower would be protected from this. I think the question is conveying that to your employees, just like you do. I mean, if you think about your policies, you're already telling people that they can bring complaints of harassment and discrimination, and that there won't be any retaliation for doing that, right? Because that's part of our training. That's part of what your policy ought to say. So this is really no different than that. You just have to be able to show, again, that you made it clear to people that you were willing to receive their concerns and their comments and their complaints with an open mind. It doesn't mean that every time somebody says, Fred wasn't wearing a mask and I want you to fire him, or, I mean, whatever it is that somebody raises, it doesn't always mean that you have to make a change or that something's wrong with the workplace. But I think you have to be able to show that you were willing to listen and at least give somebody an outlet to say, I'm concerned about this. And if you think about it as a practical matter, why wouldn't you? Because if you don't give people an outlet in your workplace to say, hey, I'm worried that 5 people on the 3rd floor weren't wearing masks today, guess where that information is going to go? I mean, somebody could easily call up the news and say, hey, I work at such and such a place, and look at this, nobody's wearing a mask. But besides the fact that, unlike several years ago, well, I'm dating myself now, but somebody could walk around with a cell phone camera and document this stuff. So if you know of rules that are being broken, you've got to address them. And I think that's what this is all a part of. I think you just need to make sure people understand that you are willing to hear them, and you're not going to get defensive if people raise issues. But again, it doesn't mean that everything everybody raises is legit or means that it has to be a major change in the workplace, but you got to hear it. And you have to commit to not treating somebody badly because they want to raise a concern with you. And that goes along with this anonymous reporting. I mean, it seems to me that the retaliation should have already been understood. But I think communicating that or putting into place an anonymous system is probably something most people don't already have. And so that needs to be done. And whether that's, like I said, it can be as simple as a box where you can put a comment, or a place on your website, a private, not a public part of your website, where somebody can leave a comment anonymously. I don't know how that works with the computer, but there must be a way to do that. Or setting up some kind of phone line where people can report those things. And importantly, because again, I see this as the basis for prior claims that I've had. If somebody does make one of those anonymous reports, you have to actually follow up on it. Now, you can't go back to them and say, I've dealt with your concern, because you don't know who they are. But in the event that, let's say somebody posts anonymously, I was there on a Tuesday and nobody in this section of the building had a face mask on. So you have that now, either in writing or on the phone. What you ought to do is document it and then show what you did to deal with it. Because you can't go back to that person and say, thanks for bringing that up, I've now dealt with it, because you don't know who they are. But you can document that the complaint was made, and then you can show, I went to that section of the building and I checked it out, and I reminded everybody over there to wear their masks, and I'm going to walk through every other day and make sure it's being done. So, it can be as simple as that.
Two questions have come in. As part of this, it includes employees can report to the media. I may not have stated that correctly, but the question is, what if you have a policy that prohibits media releases? Do you need to create an exemption from this policy as it would apply to this whistleblower clause?
I don't think we're talking about a media release, because an employee isn't entitled to speak on behalf of the employer. I think what they're talking about is no different than everybody's protected NLRA rights, because you cannot prevent an employee from speaking about concerted activity, for instance, that concerns them in the workplace. So, and most handbooks now have that little paragraph that says, when you say, you can't talk to the media, or you can't raise concerns outside of the workplace, or, this is all confidential. Most of them, we now have that paragraph that says this is not intended to stomp on anybody's protected NLRA rights. And that's essentially what this is. Employees are protected in their ability to raise issues of concerted activity. So concerns on behalf of more than one person in the workplace. So it's not a matter of saying, hey, you can issue a press release if you want to. I mean, I'm not saying in any way that you're required to do that. What I'm saying is you're not able to take action against or retaliate against somebody if they were to go to the press and say, I think there are violations that are happening here. But I don't think you're supposed to, I don't think the requirement is you have to tell people, hey, you can go to the press if you want to.
Got it. That makes sense. Another question, what are employer obligations around a hazard analysis specifically for COVID-19? Employer obligations around a hazard analysis specifically for COVID-19.
Well, again, read the guidance, and I'm not entirely sure what they mean by hazard analysis, but employers, you're not charged with knowing exactly what this virus is on a chemical or biological compound basis. I think most of us, as long as you follow what the CDC says, so like cleaning protocols and distancing, that's what I think they're talking about in terms of a hazard analysis, not like, is my HVAC system sufficient, or, really complicated stuff like that. But again, I encourage people to go back and look at this OSHA guidance.
Somebody just posted a link to an OSHA news story. I can't open it, right? I'll try to open it. But if you have questions, or perhaps could summarize any questions you have about that, please post them in the Q&A or Facebook comment or Messenger, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. Many of us are still working remotely, but there are some workplaces, especially healthcare, where people are working together. And the Super Bowl Sunday yesterday, I'm an employer, just play a little make-believe with you. And one of my employees comes in and says, "Hey, you see Shelly had a Super Bowl party at her house last night. And I'm really not comfortable that she's here working with me today." We've had this conversation before, but what can you do as an employer in those sorts of situations where people are gathering or maybe gathering, and it's making other employees uncomfortable about then working with them?
Yeah, I mean, I know we keep going around and around about this. I mean, I think the place to start is to determine, well, I guess the first thing I would do is not take anybody else's word for it. I would probably call in Shelly and say, it's been reported that you were at a party that may have violated COVID guidelines. Please tell me about it. And then you have to, I mean, if there are pictures on social media, that's one thing. But if it's not, then I think you interview her about what did you attend and were the guidelines followed, and did you wear a face mask? And if so, then I think there's probably limited action that you can take. If there's go back to that one example from a couple of months ago at the Trump rally here, if there is a very clear picture of a person attending an event that violates multiple guidelines, not only numbers of people, but distances of people and not wearing face masks and all of those things, then clearly that person has violated the requirements that you have within your workspace, and they've essentially broken the law by violating the guidance that's been issued by not only the governor, but also the CDC. And in those situations, I think you have some latitude to, at the very least, have that person out of the office for a period of time, if that's what you think is necessary to do, or in extreme circumstances, perhaps even in that person's employment based on their activity. But that, again, that bears further consideration.
By the way, that didn't happen. I'm just disclaimer.
I don't want people, I'm glad you raised that, and not to throw Shelly under the bus, but yeah. This is going to be important for employers to continue to remember that they are the ones who have to keep a reasonable head about all this. So in the same way that, my 8-year-old has drama about every single thing in her life, it's up to us to say, wait a minute, let's look at what's actually fact and what's not. And so before you were to just take somebody's word about, Shelly did this or that and she violated all these rules, for goodness sakes, you've got to go to the source as a very first step and find out directly from that person. So, because I'm afraid that that's going to happen, that everybody gets on this bandwagon of fear and intimidation, and you're worried that all your employees are going to flip out, and if you don't do something right away, but that can lead you to do the wrong thing. So that's the place to start, to me.
It's kind of like watching the Super Bowl last night, and from a distance you see all of these people and you're thinking, why are there so many people and they're not distancing? And then they zoomed in, and that's when you realize that there are all these fake people. So it's a really good point not to make assumptions until you really zone in on the facts.
Right.
Great.
Yeah, just like any other claim of misconduct, you've got to give the person accused of the misconduct the opportunity to address it and explain. And it may or may not be true, and you may or may not take action against them. And obviously social media is playing a big role in that now, but you have to at least give them the chance.
Moving on, maybe you touched on this, but FMLA, did we want to talk about that a little bit? Or did we already?
I mentioned, you know, to keep in mind that we're still talking about people meeting the 1,250-hour requirement. But more broadly than that, you know, we're in a new year. So if you're on a calendar year basis, you may now be seeking, have people seeking additional requests for leave. We do not have a new FFCRA yet. There is speculation all the time that we will, but there isn't anything as of this point. So right now, you know, if you go back to, well, I've got somebody who has somebody at home they want to protect, and so they want to not be in the office, you know, you just, it's like any other situation. You have to go through what all the leave laws are and figure out what protections they have, if any. But I think with the difference under COVID, and especially now with all these other, the EEOC and OSHA and everything else, is that you can't just jump to, well, you can't be here, we're going to terminate you. That seems to not really be an option anymore. It's more a matter of how can I provide leave? And I've answered this question many times in the last couple of weeks, and it may come down to, look, if you want to take the time off for COVID-related reasons, whatever they are, and you don't have any more protected time, you're not a person with a disability, you don't have any FMLA, maybe the solution is an unpaid leave of absence, but the job is not held open. So it doesn't tie your hands in terms of keeping your workplace going, but on the other hand, it lets that person have whatever time they need, and when they are able to or willing to come back, then the issue is there a job available for you? Because you don't have to make up a job. So, you know, that seems to be a reasonable solution in a lot of these situations, especially when there's, well, unless, of course, there's protected leave time. But do not forget, employers, please do not forget that we are now a month and a week into the earned leave law. So make sure you remember that you're applying, because people have now earned some leave under that law, because it's, you know, for every 40 hours, they're getting an hour. So don't forget to apply that to any of these situations. It's new, and it's easy to forget that you have to give that to them.
All right, this is great. We have a few minutes left with the Anne Marie at Redmond Winchell. If you have questions, this is your chance to ask them. Again, use the Q&A feature or Facebook message, Facebook comments, and we're happy to take your questions. Anything that we touched on earlier in our conversation that you want to be sure we remind people about?
Yeah, let me just reiterate the workers' comp piece, because I'm so fearful that people will not understand their obligation and end up in a bad situation, because you know, I assume all employers know that if an employee reports a claim of an injury with lost time associated, the employer only has 14 days to deny that claim, or they pick it up automatically, no matter what. So if somebody says, I have COVID, I need to be out, I think I got it here, that is a huge red flag, and you should immediately notify your carrier so that they can file the appropriate documentation to deny that claim, assuming that's what you're going to do. So do not make the assumption that just because you disagree that something is work-related or not means you don't need to do anything, because that is absolutely not how it works. And that, again, the same is true if they're getting a vaccine and you've required it or encouraged it and they have a bad reaction, the exact same thing holds true.
So in the chat, just as a reminder, somebody did post an OSHA news release. That's just a kind of a brief summary of what we've been talking about. So that's kind of your, I'm dating myself, your Cliff Notes version. And then,
and we had sent that email, I think last week, right after, the day after it came out or something, that did the same thing. So hopefully that's helpful.
Is it on your website, Redmond Winchell? Is there?
It says yes.
Okay, so check that out. And then the website is right behind Anne Marie's head. So there it is.
You can't miss it.
And Shelley also posted the full guidance from OSHA. There's a link there. And we just had another message come in. Hang on. Oh. Okay. Vaccines. The vaccines are going to continue. I think will continue to be a question here. The question is, there was a conversation about the person who gets a vaccine, quote, if we encouraged it, please clarify if the person has a reaction, do we still need to file a first report if we didn't make the vaccine mandatory?
Yes, I would, because it's a very fine line between whether you encouraged it enough to make it work related. And we have seen this countless times with regard to the flu vaccinations long before COVID. And so the issue was, if an employer is deemed to have strongly encouraged an employee to have the vaccine, then they are going to be responsible for its effects, even if they didn't require it. So it goes back to a very specific fact analysis about what did you do to encourage it. So in other words, did you say, we're going to have somebody on site vaccinating people, we're going to pay you for your time to go do it. We have a sign up that says everybody's strongly encouraged to do this. You know, those are all the factors that are going to weigh in favor of encouraging people. But each judge is going to make their own assessment about whether or not you sufficiently encourage somebody to have it. And so if somebody testifies that even though you publicly said this is voluntary, if a supervisor said you better get your butt down the hall and get your vaccine done, you know, then you buy the claim. So it's all very fact specific. And so in every situation, if somebody alleges that they have a reaction and they make any insinuation that they think this is because you required it or it was work related, you notify your carrier. You're far better off filing a first report and a knock than not. So, because that way you know you're covered.
Right, better safe than sorry. Just
absolutely
cover yourself. Okay.
But again, your carrier will weigh in on whether or not they think, because ultimately it'll be their decision as to whether or not it needs to be filed. So that's the very first conversation that you should have.
It occurred to me before we started this afternoon that next month it will be a year since we did this first meeting with you, and we may have to share that when we hit that month threshold, because it would be interesting to look back at what we were talking about almost a year ago when all of this started. And Dr. Nesson was joined us from PCHC, and I remember asking him at that time, well, if it gets here, if it gets to Maine, and he clearly said, oh, it will. Yeah, it will.
We were all in person.
Yeah, and we were in person. We were distancing, but we were in person, and it's been quite a ride. And we're so grateful that you continue to do this with us and keep us informed as employers and businesses about what we need to know. And we have a lot of you joining us this afternoon. So we've got a few more minutes. If you have any questions, please ask those. Otherwise, we'll wrap up. And Shelley has recorded this, so it will be up on our Facebook page after the event if you missed the beginning and you want to watch it again, or share this with anybody whom you think might benefit. That would be great. Boy, we covered a lot of ground. So OSHA will come out with an update, you said probably in March.
March 15 is their deadline. If they're going to issue what's called that emergency temporary standard, that's the next directive that the president gave them, and that would have the effect of law. So that will be a different situation than this guidance. But frankly, just to be clear, if I haven't already been, just because this guidance is a guidance does not mean it should be disregarded. I mean, you want to look at this as, this is what they're telling me to do, and this is what I'm going to do.
You had mentioned the EEOC as well. Was there anything we should know? Or maybe you already talked about it and I'm just.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's nothing new so far because last time we talked about their opinion on whether or not an employer could incentivize getting a vaccine as part of a wellness program. And right now they're saying the only incentive you can give is extremely minimal, like a water bottle or a very small gift card. And but that's for a wellness program under the EEOC and the ADA. If you are an employer who's not giving the vaccine yourself or having your 10-day provider give it or your medical personnel, then the issue is different. And that's why you see in the news some of those companies who are paying people for a period of time to go have the vaccine. So they're giving a different kind of incentive. And so to clarify the issue about the incentive under the wellness program, that's what these employers, including the U.S. Chamber, have written to the EEOC to say, we're not really clear on what you're saying here. Can you give us some better guidance?
All right, thank you for that. I think that's it. Looks like the questions have been answered. If you have questions after the event, feel free to message us, or you can email me directly, deb@bangorregion.com, and we'll see if we can help you. Otherwise, we'll be back in 2 weeks. Anything we should expect to see over the course of the next 2 weeks?
I don't know if we'll get something more from OSHA before that March deadline. It's entirely possible that we will, but we'll certainly let you know. And of course, the EEOC could respond at any time to that request for clarification. And then, of course, you know, tomorrow everything could change. So we'll just have to see how it goes.
Oh, yes, and we'll keep you posted if there's anything major that happens between now and then. In the meantime, thank you, Anne-Marie Story, so much. Karen Sichters at Redmond Winchell, who's somewhere in the room. There she is. And Shelly Sund, who is always a great sport. There she is.
And where's the dog? We want to see the dog.
Oh, he's out somewhere.
Thank
Josie was listening to this from the car, I guess. John posted, so he was looking for you.
Oh, great.
Presentation.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, thank you all so much, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Again, we'll get this up on Facebook. And Anne-Marie, we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
All righty, thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. See you later.